Before we begin, I'd just like to acknowledge the traditional custodians of the Macquarie University land, the Watamadigal clan of the Darug Nation, whose cultures and customs have nurtured and continue to nurture this land since the Dreamtime. We pay our respects to elders past, present and future. So welcome to those of you who've joined us in 187. It's lovely to see you all, and thanks to all of you who've joined us online, and also thanks for your patience. It's quite frightening how quickly the new book seminars roll around. So it seems to be the state of the world at the moment. So today we are going to hear from our very own Associate Professor Kate Rossmanith. Kate is an author, an essayist and academic. She is currently an Australian Research Council Future Fellow. Her background is in anthropology, performance studies and creative writing, and she researches the role of emotion, enactment and narrative in legal contexts. She's an Associate Professor of Media and Cultural Studies here at Macquarie University. So we're going to stick with our usual format, which is essentially to have a conversation and conversing with, I was going to say interrogating, but it is a conversation, cross-examining, having a conversation with Kate and our special guest, and I'll let Kate introduce our special guest, is Professor Sarah Sorial. Can we make our guests feel welcome?
Thanks so much for that introduction, Andrew, and I'll just introduce one of my co-editors is Dr. Michael Prof, who is here online today from the University of Adelaide. I'm so delighted Michael can be here, and he's in the area of forensic psychology and has done a lot of work on remorse and shame, and is the co-author of a 2010 book called Remorse, Psychological and Jurisprudential Perspectives, which he co-authored with another one, our lead co-editor actually, Dr. Stephen Tudor, who's unable to be here today. So Stephen is from La Trobe University, and our fourth co-editor is Professor Richard Wiseman from York University in Toronto. And for obvious reasons, Richard just said he wasn't going to get up in the middle of the night to log on to this as much as he loves us all. So the four of us co-edited this book. Anyway, so Michael and I are going to do a double-handed. Thank you so much for being here, Michael.
No worries.
Thank you. Shall we get started? Well, thank you, everyone, and thank you for the invitation to have a conversation with Kate about this book. And it will be a conversation, not an interrogation or cross-examination or anything like that. So I'll just begin by introducing the book. So we're here to talk about this new edited collection by Kate, Stephen, Richard and Michael, Remorse and Criminal Justice, Multidisciplinary Perspectives. And I think it's safe to say that remorse is one of those infinitely fascinating emotions that seems to be relevant to all aspects of the criminal justice system, from sentencing all the way through to parole. And it seems to preoccupy all of these different actors, from judges, lawyers, jurors, the general public, the media, victims, and so on. So this collection takes us through a range of complex issues about an offender's remorse and its place in criminal justice, from how we should define remorse to how it should be expressed, how judges and jurors recognise it, and whether defendants who express it successfully, whatever that means, should have different treatment, whether their sentence should be reduced and so on, or whether in capital cases they don't get the death penalty. Now, what I love about this book, and what I love about the work of all four of these editors, is that they've really given us this unprecedented, intimate access to the criminal justice system that we wouldn't otherwise have. I think it's safe to say that for many of us, we probably have very limited access to the criminal justice system or contact with it. And I think even in the study of law or law research, your access is kind of filtered through very complex judgments, through facts of a case, through quite tedious legislation. And so I just think to see these inner workings of the criminal justice system, to see the ways judges grapple with these complex issues, to see how defendants struggle to display remorse, is just really fascinating. And so I just really love this very unprecedented access that we're given through your work. So I'll stop talking now and hand over to you. And perhaps we could just begin by you telling us very briefly what remorse is and the role that it plays in the criminal justice system.
Yes. Okay. So I'll answer the second part of that first, I think, because the first part of it is a very hard question to answer. So So remorse is, as Sarah said, plays this quite important role throughout criminal justice processes, and it's a mitigating factor at sentencing. So what that means is that in most common law jurisdictions worldwide, if a judge decides that someone is truly sorry for what they've done, then that judge is legally obliged to give that person a lesser sentence. And remorse also has a role in capital cases in the USA in the granting of mercy in death penalty decisions. So it literally is a life and death matter. Like, the stakes can't be any higher than that. It also has a role in the parole process as well. So it's got this. It's just this enduring thing all the way through the criminal justice system, and at the same time, it's unclear how it's assessed. So how the heck do people make decisions about someone's remorse? You know, what is remorse and what does the justice system want it to do? In terms of what it is, the etymology of remorse is remordere, which means, I think, to be rebitten. It's like the conscience, the idea that the conscience is being rebitten again and again. And in terms of, talking about, when I asked a lawyer what remorse was, a lawyer said, look, it's really ephemeral. And when I asked a judge what remorse was, the judge said, I knew you were going to ask that, and then picked up the OED definition of remorse and read it back out to me. So I thought that, he was sort of smiling as he did it, but this idea that it's some kind of consistent definition, or that the law has even defined what remorse is a furphy. That's not the case. I'm going to throw to Michael actually about this question of what is remorse, because of course, Michael, what's been exciting about working on this collection is that the four of us, Steve, Michael, Rich and I, we come from different disciplines, and we're studying this thing in different ways. And so Michael's based in psychology, and so it'd be great to hear from you, Michael, about this question of what remorse is.
And it's a very complicated question, let's say. Yeah. So I came at it really trying to work out, because in psychology, remorse is talked about as an emotion. So a lot of my struggles, going back to PhD work, was to try and say, okay, how is it, what is it and how is it different from similar emotions? And ultimately I kind of floundered, I think. And so I can't do better than go back to the definition, which is really the work of our co-editor, Stephen Tudor. And this is a philosophical definition. And that comes from our book, which is that remorse is somehow a recognition that you've wronged and harmed another person, that you're responsible, you did something voluntarily, you have some kind of feelings, pricking of conscience goes with that, and you want to do something about it, usually reparation. You might desire to be forgiven and to be said you are remorseful. Hopefully you've done something in that direction. So it's a good enough working definition, I think. And from some of the research and from judges, when it's been put before them, they say, yeah, that sounds about right. So it's a good working definition. I would call it, really these days, it's kind of a moral position. So while it's emotional, I don't think you can strictly say it's an emotion. So I find it much more useful to break remorse down into its similar emotions, which are more recognised. And so I would say it sits as some mixture between shame and guilt, really. That's the best way to talk about it. Mm. But it's more than just regretting because you suffered because of what you did.
Yeah. And what's really interesting when you ask judges about remorse, they'll say, because I was coming at it from an anthropological perspective, so I did a, ethnographic study where I went and hang out with people in the justice system for a couple of years and talk to them and talk to judges a lot about what, how they went about assessing it. And they would say, well, it's assessed on the evidence. And then I'd say, okay, well, what's evidence of remorse? And then they would say things like, well, it could be, for instance, if someone, offers an early guilty plea. So that might be evidence of remorse, but then someone might do that because they're just wanting a lesser sentence for having offered an early guilty plea, or it could be that the evidence against them is so overwhelming that it makes sense legally for them to offer a guilty plea early. So there could be a cynical reason why that's the case, or it might be that they've, in cases of fraud, they may have tried to repay them the money or very quickly, or it could be that that friends and family testify and talk about the kind of agonies that the person's been in about what they've done, or a psychologist might offer a report, or the offender themselves might give evidence and sort of weep in the witness box. And I remember a defence lawyer saying to me, she would tell her clients, you need to chuck a sad, but not too much of a sad. So about in the witness box. Or it could be, the offender in the courtroom, physically profoundly distressed in the witness box. It could be their behaviour immediately after the offence. So it could be, for instance, there was a case where a woman deliberately ran over a young man with her car. She used the car as a weapon and she killed him. She stalked him with it and ran him over and killed him. But then straight after she'd done it, she jumped out of the car and tried to lift it off him and started tearing her hair out, screaming at what had happened. And the judge, that was one of the bits of evidence the judge used to determine what he later called her immediate and continuing remorse. So that's just such an interesting kind of example of remorse evidence. But of course, you'd say to judges, when can you tell someone sorry? And they'd say, well, there's genuine remorse, and then there's artificial, cynical, perfunctory, manufactured remorse. So that this idea that you could, that there are all these distinctions of remorse. And sometimes I'd say, but isn't remorse like pregnancy? Like you either are or you're not. And then they would sort of, I'm not sure how to respond to that. And our colleague Stephen Tudor in our book, there you go, has written a fantastic chapter called Remorse in the Grey Zone, and it's and then the subtitle is The Sort of Remorseful Offender, and it's trying to speak to that very space of where judges are sitting there looking at someone going, well, they're sort of remorseful, but there's something that's constrained about it, or there's a reason why it hasn't quite gone the full way, but there is a bit of remorse there. So he's done this excellent kind of chapter on what he calls the sort of remorseful offender. It's a long answer to that question.
No, well, I actually want to come back to this issue of how do you judge remorse. But before I get there, you mentioned that you all come from very different disciplinary backgrounds. So could you tell us a little bit about your disciplinary background and what drew you to this subject matter?
Yeah. Michael, do you want to answer that first? I mean, because Michael, my three co-editors have been studying this longer than I have. I started my study about 12 years ago, but these guys have been studying it for a lot longer. And yeah, Michael, do you want to answer that?
Sure. So my interest started fairly early in my career. So I was a clinical psychologist working in a prison psychiatric division. And so, at least on the surface, remorse was really about pure curiosity, because I would see it mentioned in reports all the time, and I'd be thinking, that's not remorse, or what are they talking about? What's the evidence? And then I had some encounters with some of my clients, and that really made me think. So these were often people with severe mental illness, schizophrenia among them. And so sometimes there were no excuses, and they'd say things like, I should be in here. It's just right that I'm in prison because I did this terrible thing, and look at the people it harmed. And I'd go, wow, it's I don't know if you're going to get to this later, but this very much chimes with that chapter in the book by Jamie O'Donoghue And when I saw that work, I thought, yes, this takes me back to exactly why I got interested in this subject in the first place.
Yes,
There's something very striking about a very remorseful person in circumstances when you don't necessarily expect it. Yeah.
I think we will come back to that issue a little bit later.
Yeah, in terms of so where I so for Richard Wiseman, for instance, his background is as a sociologist, so he came at it and from the study of sociology, and Stephen Tudor is law and philosophy. That's his sort of legal jurisprudence. And mine is performance studies initially, which is, a discipline that's born of a marriage between theatre and anthropology, and in part is interested in the ways in which we perform ourselves in social and cultural kind of environments and settings. So, of course, the courtroom is a place of performance, and a sort of and people have to perform remorse in there. And sometimes they might really feel this thing called remorse, or sometimes not, but there's enactments that happen. And so that's where I started getting, about 12 years ago, very deep into research regarding criminal justice processes and ethnographic kind of methods and stuff, which I used in my PhD, 25 years ago or something, but then we're able to apply in the courtroom. And then out of that, I've also then used creative writing strategies as methods to try to further understand and get at sort of some of the knowledges that were, I guess, circulating or emerging through that ethnographic kind of encounter.
So this issue has come up a lot already of, well, how do you know that someone is remorseful? And you and I were talking about this before. If it's an emotion, sometimes emotions are really private, or someone might not perform remorse in the way that the courts expect it. And you spend the first part of the book talking about how you judge remorse and the sorts of challenges that defendants face in trying to express remorse. Do you want to say a little bit more about that? Particularly, I was interested in your paper on how difficult it is for defendants not only to express remorse at sentencing, but they kind of have to continue expressing it through what you call the long haul of a prison sentence, right through to a parole board hearing. What's involved in that kind of performance, and how do we know, or how do judges know that a defendant is, genuinely remorseful?
Yeah, so my colleague, Dr. Maggie Hall, who's from Western Sydney University, and I together, we co-authored one of the chapters in this book called Long Haul Remorse, and it is looking at the ways in which the kind of standard or accepted ways of performing remorse in the courtroom are really unfit for purpose when it comes to a prison sentence. They don't translate at all. The problem is that the question of remorse is really important at parole, at the other end, except that's never made really clear to the prisoner as they enter the prison to serve their sentence. And when in the courtroom is full of moral language, and this question of remorse comes up. And as I said earlier, a defence lawyer telling someone you've got to chuck a sad, not too much of a sad. This is that, and judges trying to get at, how do you feel now about what you've done? Like what they're trying to, and that the offender will have been primed. This is kind of, and that's your moment, mate, to say, oh, just so terribly sorry about whatever. So there's this kind of encounter that is expected in the courtroom. The problem is that people move into the prison space, and that prison space, listen to me, it sounds like a conceptual thing. It's not, it's actually prison. So prison, they're in jail, and it's the prison space. They're in prison, and the word remorse is never used. So the remorse language is not present at all, and instead a different set of languages and discourses enter the spaces for them, and it has to do with victim empathy. So victim empathy is the stand-in for remorse, but no one tells them that. So remorse is, one of the points we make is that remorse is hiding in plain sight in prison. But so instead, it's this big question that people are supposed to do rehabilitation programs. Sometimes those programs are a bit ill-conceived or are incredibly hard to access and get into. So their names are put down to do a prison rehabilitation program, but they never get into it because their sentence is only 14 months long, and they're on the wait list and they never get to do the program, and then their parole date comes up, and then there's the question of, have you changed, have you transformed, what's the evidence of it? Or if they have done these programs, then maybe they start the program and then they're moved to a different prison. Part of the problems with some of these programs, for instance, is that you need to, a prisoner's account of what they did, the crime, has to match the police record and the sentencing notes, but the prisoner is never given the police record or the sentencing notes. So they're trying to recall what the official narrative of the crime was and then feed it back to the powers that be in the prison. It is absurd, like it's totally absurd in the prisons, or then certain forms of narrative are expected from them and they're not producing what is expected. So, one of the most extraordinary encounters I had was with this guy on parole. He was post-release prisoner, and I interviewed him, and he said that in prison, as part of the rehabilitation program, he was forced to write his own autobiography in prison, where he had to identify in his life where it had all gone wrong. Like the psychologists in the prison, it wouldn't have been someone like Michael, who would have been a far more evolved psychologist, but these psychologists in the prison were sort of saying, we want you to pinpoint where in your life you thought it all went wrong. And he wrote this account of poverty, like he was incredibly poor growing up. Had been in prison for armed robbery. He started to steal stuff. They'd had no food, not enough money to buy food as a family, whatever. And that was the narrative he provided. And he was told to go back and rewrite it because he needed to apparently talk about how he hadn't felt loved as a child and that he didn't have a father figure. But he said to me that he did feel loved. He had a wonderful family. He didn't have a father, but he did feel loved. But he went back and rewrote his own autobiography, explaining that it was that he didn't have enough love in his life, and that was why he'd done what he'd done. He needed to do that to get to the next step of the program. So that's just strange. So then what happens is that parole arrives. I mean, apart from the fact that prison is hard, you need to enact different things in different ways in different places, in the mess hall, in the prison yard, in the psychologist's office, in the actual group therapy sessions or whatever, in order to simply survive that environment. This idea, if you walked around kind of enacting sort of remorse the whole time, what would that even look like? How would you even survive in that kind of environment? So then the parole comes around, and I've sat in on parole meetings, and you sit there in that parole board in Parramatta, and all the notes are there, like these little scrawled notes from the prison authorities about someone. There's codes about whether someone's completed what and what have they completed, and and this was, I must admit, this was several years ago. I don't know how the parole board is being run now, but certainly several years ago. That you'd sit there and the question would be, has the person shown remorse? So that's where there was this giant mismatch about the actual prison environment and whether it was even possible to demonstrate some long-lasting demonstration of remorse in prison. Long answer.
No,
Yes.
that's fascinating. And so we've talked about these challenges in expressing remorse, but coming back to the point that you made earlier, Michael, about what attracted you to this topic in the first place, is on the one hand, we expect defendants and judges expect defendants to exhibit remorse in this way, but there are different standards for different kinds of defendants. And for defendants who are mentally ill, the expectation is not that they would express remorse in all of these ways. But in this really fascinating paper by Donoghue and Simmons, which draws on a lot of empirical data and interviews with mentally ill people, they do express deep remorse. And it seems quite genuine because there's no expectation that they'll do it. So there's this kind of flip side to this, and we have different expectations of different defendants. But I guess what interested me in reading this paper, and you can both elaborate on this, is that it seems like there is some kind of intrinsic value to remorse for offenders that is unrelated to whether or not they're going to get a reduced sentence in doing this performance in a courtroom. Would you agree that there is a kind of intrinsic value
I'd throw that to
serves
Michael.
some kind of personal function?
There's even more to this, because these are people who are found not guilty by reason of mental impairment, right? So the law is saying you're not responsible. And these people are saying, hang on, I am responsible. Look what I did. This was terrible. Those people suffered. Right? And so that's really interesting. They're actually countering the legal narrative in that sense. So what I think it's about, this goes back to people I observed, and it seemed like there are a few striking people who are actually talking in this way, and they actually seem to be doing something apart. Basically, they're saying, oh, I'm not my illness. I've got a severe mental illness, but and they were the people who are managing it in some way. They might have struggled. They might have had terrible symptoms. They might have spent a lot of time getting the balance of medication right. But in the end, they were saying, I'm someone else. I'm managing this illness. And so I think that's part of what it's about. It's about, in some degree, affirming one's humanity, saying, I am a moral person. Yes, I've got a severe illness, and that doesn't explain it all.
Yeah, there's Richard Wiseman in his sociology work on remorse has talked about that, this question, and it totally picks up on what Michael just said, what's the value of remorse maybe for the offender. What it allows the offender to do is to split off from themselves, like the part of themselves that had committed the offence, and they can then join the moral community, this is Richard's argument, and together with the moral community condemn the offence, condemn the behaviour, and so that's that sense of somehow being reintegrated into the larger group. And it's a really powerful metaphor, that idea of, joining the moral group to condemn the behaviour, and in doing so rejoining the moral community.
So just to complicate matters even more, again, I found it fascinating, the expressions of remorse in capital cases. And so prisoners on death row have an opportunity before they're being executed in the US to give a talk, give a speech. And sometimes victims or victims' families are present at this. The offender's family might be there as well. And often they do express remorse before they're executed. What work is remorse doing in those contexts? Who is it for?
Michael?
That's a very difficult question. So who is it for? Look, I think in a real sense, it's for the families of the victims. So I think it has some value there. It's probably also for the offenders themselves. So like I said, with mentally ill prisoners, it's something about affirming one's humanity. But the circumstances of doing this is almost unthinkable. It's very hard to think about. At the point of being executed, now's the time to express remorse. And so I think that's one of the points that Judy Eaton makes in this. This is not really the optimal time to be talking about remorse at this point. And also, to my mind, it also has some aspects of a performance, which can be seen to detract from remorse in itself, like Kate's talked about a lot, because this is your final performance in some sense, right? And so it would be much better to be not expressing remorse at that time. And if we try and imagine, they're also facing their imminent execution at the same time, that's almost an unbearable pressure. So one of the suggestions at the end of that chapter is, wouldn't it be much better to do it another way, which has been tried apparently, is to have victim-offender mediation, or at least with the families, for those who are interested, prior, sometime leading up to that, because this is the chance to have a conversation out of this performance aspect, because in that circumstance there is really no point to a performance in the encounter with the families of someone who killed. Right? So,
Yeah.
There's also that sense that this is speaking to like a genre or a performance that's bigger than them all, which is, of course, this, as you know, researchers have pointed out, remorse in the justice system is a theological hangover, in that it was originally, you know, there to save people's souls. Like you would show remorse just before you were executed, and it kept the moral and social order because everybody would know then the offender's soul was in heaven. So it's sort of it's strange, I think, as a paradigm or something. So I think that's operating there as well.
Well, yeah, because I mean, what was striking about that chapter is that an offender is grappling with all of these emotions. I mean, they're about to be executed.
The state is about to kill them.
I mean, there's this an act of violence that's about to occur, and they're having to go through this performance yet again. So yeah, it was just intriguing. Like, why are we doing this? But I think that's a really good explanation, that there is this kind of theological hangover.
Yeah, some expectation or something of this is the moment where I now do this thing, like this is the now recant, or the, you know, whatever it feels big.
Yeah. But I guess it also points to this kind of collective dimension to remorse. And in the final section, you draw out these relational aspects of remorse, and that it's an ethical encounter, and that remorse functions not just in the context of a trial or in the context of an offender coming to terms with what they've done, but it has this social and community aspect to it. And I found it quite interesting, the chapter on the South African Truth and Reconciliation Commission and the function of remorse for communities that have suffered this kind of collective trauma. What do you see as the role in that context?
I don't feel I'm going to do Pumla's chapter justice. We were so honoured that we had a final chapter contributor was this leading South African scholar called Pumla Gobodo Madikizela. I always feel like I'm going to say her name right. And she's the author of that extraordinary 2003 book, A Human Being Died That Night, if anyone's heard of that award-winning and quite brilliant book. She writes this most extraordinary chapter about ethical encounter, and she opens it with an account of a woman whose mother was murdered by Eugene de Kock as part of his death squad. He was the commander of the death squad under the apartheid government, and she goes to see him, and she was 5 when he murdered her mother, and she goes to see him and has this chat with him, and the account of the conversation across the table where she says this woman's knees were brushing against his under the table as they were talking so closely, and their faces were so close, they were breathing the same air as she was getting from him an account of the final minutes of her mother's life to try to understand the minutes and hours and minutes leading up to her mother's death. And she, in that encounter, she felt his remorse. And she reported this afterwards and saying that so Pumla explains how this woman reported this afterwards. What Pumla opens up is the extraordinary situation where a woman like this has forgiven or has seen the remorse in a man like that and has forgiven him even, but that the larger moral community refuses to and rejects this woman's account of having encountered remorse in the man. And it's not necessarily just any community, moral community, it's the community who were beneficiaries of the apartheid era. So it's like they will not, it somehow serves the community to keep him as a monster rather than to allow for the possibility that there is remorse. I mean, it is so, have I done that even remotely justice, Michael? Because like, it is so complex and nuanced, this chapter.
I think you've done a very good job. I'm not sure any of us can quite do it justice. This is an extraordinary chapter, really.
Yeah, and it's worth reading for many reasons, but it's unlike anything I've ever read on remorse scholarship, and takes you to a moral place that is almost unthinkable. And I don't actually think there's anyone else on the planet who could have written this chapter. That's how profound it feels, actually.
Should we stop and take questions from the audience?
Richard and I have been secretly sort of communicating here and saying this. Neither of us want you to stop because it's just so fascinating.
Oh, you say that to all the girls.
Yeah. you can read my text.
Yeah.
Look, we have a few minutes, and so if there are any questions, now is your time. And for everybody on Zoom, we can hear you very, very clearly. So please feel free to unmute and ask with your voices rather than the chat. Karen.
Thank you for this wonderful collection you've created and this fascinating thing. And I just, there's something troubling me, a theme that's been coming through in various parts of the discussion, which is the idea of skills, remorse skills, in a way. And you know, we talk about performance, and performance is something we're all performing ourselves all the time, but it's also something we talk about having performance skills. And then you told the story of this person who had to write his biography twice. I mean, that's a skill. I think write a biography. So is there any such thing as skills training for remorse, or is that would the legal system recognize remorse as a skill at any level?
No. Like, I don't think so. Don't you think it's seen as a natural occurring thing? Like, don't you think, Michael, it's like it wouldn't be... I mean, having said that, like, I interviewed this guy. He'd spent a period in prison, and he was highly educated. In fact, he was a former lawyer, I think, who'd gone to prison for several years for, anyway, yeah, stuff. But he, to do with underage kids, and it was just awful. But I spoke to him and I did this interview. He ended up writing a pamphlet in the prison, which he circulated to all the other prisoners, how to show genuine remorse. He literally called it How to Show Genuine Remorse. But it wasn't to fake it. He talked about you need to actually feel it. And he walked them through how to feel genuine remorse in this pamphlet, which he sent to me. It was extraordinary. So it did, you know, in the same way that when you're trying to teach children how to be sorry, like how to, you know, say it like you mean it, kid, is what you say to your child. When I'm really sorry for what I did. Okay, well, actually say it like you mean it's that thing. So I think that was one of the only encounters I had where there was that explicit pedagogical sort of way to think about what remorse was, because otherwise it's like, are you really feeling, are you not really, you know, isn't it a natural, shouldn't you just, you know, we're all moral beings who just naturally feel this thing called remorse, and it just naturally happens. Would you say that, Michael?
Probably most of us will feel it or something like it. Some of us don't feel it at all. That's just a fact, yeah. I didn't hear the question properly, so I'm kind of picking up on
it was about skills, like that idea of remorse skills. Like the question was like, are skills ever something that are talked about with justice system professionals, like that remorse is a skill?
You might talk about the difference. I mean, I found it quite useful to talk about the difference between shame and guilt. this is going on slightly off topic, but I find moving from people coming with shame to actually moving towards guilt is therapeutically useful, and useful to other people, in fact, because they end up actually engaging and doing something and taking other people's perspectives. The whole issue, though, remorse skills is the trap that happens in the sentencing situation where there is a demand for a performance, so people perform, and then the immediate question was that an authentic performance or wasn't it? And you end up in there is compulsion to do it, but that conditions of compelling a performance immediately cast doubt on it, which is why a number of people have said it should be taken away from the sentencing aspect. That being said, I don't think it ever will be, but that's another issue.
Just on that, very briefly, Hugh Dillon's paper I thought was really interesting in bringing out this kind of dialogical aspect to remorse. And so, he talks about being on the bench and how in a busy courtroom, it's actually really difficult to assess remorse at all. But he talks about this particular encounter that he had with a defendant where he had an opportunity to actually engage in dialogue with him. And he started out thinking, this guy's not remorseful at all, and then completely changes his mind and gives him a suspended sentence, I think it was.
So this is just so Hugh is a former magistrate and deputy state coroner, and he writes this beautiful chapter in our book. So that's when he was on the bench.
Sorry. But I'll stop because I think there are more hands.
Great question, Karen. Thank you. We've got a question from Catherine, who's online. Catherine, can you unmute, and then we should be able to hear you.
Yes, can you hear me?
Got you.
Great. First, I just want to say thank you for this really fascinating conversation today. By way of background, I'm from Macquarie Law School, and I have been writing about the prerogative of mercy and the role of mercy in the criminal justice system. So I'm really fascinated with this talk on remorse. One thing that occurred to me was this idea of how offenders need to continue to show remorse at so many stages through the criminal justice system. And I'm just wondering whether or not there's been any examination of how exhausting that can be for offenders, given that remorse is such a deep and profound emotion. And at what point do we allow an offender to set their remorse aside to be able to move on? Or is there an expectation that there needs to be a demonstration of remorse that's lifelong, which may then detract from their quality of life?
That's a really good question. Michael?
I would say that is a really good question, and I'm not sure anyone has studied it, honestly. Is there a point where we allow someone to set it aside? I think it depends on whose perspective you're talking from. So some people might never allow that demand to be set aside, others will.
Yes, particularly I think with what you were saying about how there's an expectation that prisoners will engage in rehabilitation programs and so on. So there's an expectation that there's this outward display of using that remorse to try and reintegrate. But if we're expecting them to continue that remorse for the rest of their lives, are we actually allowing that reintegration? So yeah, it was just something from this talk that made me wonder how we could then consider combining things like mercy and remorse to allow for a fulfilling life for a prisoner, because I think a lot of people forget that on the other side of the bars is a person and whether or not they're entitled to a life.
No, look, this is a fascinating question, and as Kate said, I think remorse is hiding in plain sight, because in standard offender rehabilitation, remorse is not even in the language. It's about managing risk, doing the things, addressing the things that got you into offending in the first place so that you don't reoffend, and that's the language. Nevertheless, what slips in around the edges is other sorts of talk. So Kate's mentioned empathy, but there's also responsibility pops up. And in terms of the risk-need responsivity model, responsivity doesn't really figure theoretically, yet it keeps coming up. So, Kate's quite right on that. And Maggie? It's there, but it's hidden. And so if it's hidden, it becomes very hard to talk about, or the place you talk about it is not at all clear. Nevertheless, it's been my experience in groups with offenders, you do not have to probe for this, it will come up until somebody shuts it down and say, okay, this week we're looking at this issue instead. It will come up spontaneously, because this is about people saying, this is who I am and this is what I did and this is what I think about it. So in my view, there must be a place for that. So that's part of treating offenders as human beings. So beyond that, it may well have benefits. So does it lead to reduced recidivism? That's a bit contested and unclear. Does it lead to greater acceptance when people then rejoin the community? I think it probably does, and that certainly needs more research. That's where my mind has been turning more recently. So there's something about being able to talk about the narrative of what you did in a certain way that will come across to other people and they will hear it. So especially with, say, people who've known an offender beforehand, from their perspective, this is a person I know and now they did this thing, and how on earth do I put that together? And so when the offender's having a narrative where they've had time to process this and be able to tell the story of, well, this was me and this is how I got to what I did and this is what I think about it, then starts to rebuild that relationship. And we know that social capital, so-called, is very important in rehabilitation of prisoners. So I might leave it there before hogging more time.
Thank you, Michael. Bridget.
Thanks, Andrew, and everyone for this terrific and really important discussion. The collection features scholars and scholarship from different parts of the world. Obviously, you've mentioned South Africa, and I know that there's also a chapter in the section on war and trauma related to Yugoslavia. I'm wondering, in the sort of day-to-day legal systems of, say, Australia, the United States and the United Kingdom, if you see differences, Kate, in the way in which, well, differences around expectations for remorse and perhaps differences in how remorse is sort of enacted or performed in the courtroom?
Just trying to think. I think we're similar, obviously, to the UK system. Australia is. I think, would you say, Michael, that in the US there is just more of an expectation and opportunity to hear from offenders in a way that we don't as much in Australia, like the oratory or something?
I'm not actually sure about that. It certainly features less in statutory and case law in the US than it does here. I've looked at this myself, and it appears quite a lot in Australian law compared to some other countries, let's say. Actually, that remorse is recognised as a mitigating factor, and occasionally you get an indication of, well, this is what it looks like. That almost doesn't appear in US law, yet it certainly features apparently in capital cases particularly. So it's hard to answer that, really. Every jurisdiction is quite different.
Yeah, and also there actually haven't been that many ethnographic studies. So where you're actually getting on the ground, what's happening in the room, what are the actual exchanges that are going on? Because it's really hard to research. It's really expensive research. It's time consuming. So there haven't been that many ethnographic studies around the world. There's some very interesting work coming out of Europe. So they're in Sweden, Italy, Denmark. So there's some great research that's been emerging in the last few years in that area. But yeah, it's hard to research. And in our final chapter, we kind of say in that final chapter, a book about remorse in the justice system is also necessarily a book about emotion in the law, which is a hard thing to research, because, you know, what is it you're looking at, and what are you, how would you even approach it? So I think our final chapter, in a sense, is kind of reflections on how does one even go about looking at this, the role that emotion plays, doesn't play, and ought to play in criminal justice contexts.
I think there were some hands up in the audience as well.
Earlier on, the definition that was as like acknowledging that they did wrong, they're responsible, and that they want to make reparations for it. Does it matter if those are expressed in a more, I guess, in a less emotional way, like legally? Like if someone's like, you know, I guess without distress, if they acknowledge that they did something and they said, yes, I should take responsibility for it, and I want to make up for it, but they don't actually emotionally have sort of a visible response, like, is that?
Yeah. So, Michael, the question, it's going, actually speaks directly to Richard's research, I think, but it's the question is that earlier definition that you gave about remorse, where you were citing Steve's sort of little summary of what remorse would be. The question, it's a great one, is that if that was being expressed but there was no emotion around it at all, would that still count as remorse? Like if you're doing those things, you know, you're acknowledging what you've done, you want to seek reparation or whatever, but there's no emotion around it, is that still remorse? And of course, you know, we've got our colleague Richard Wiseman is the sociologist. He talks about the distinction between apology and remorse, and he said, you know, an apology. Now, I'm now going to try to remember what the distinction is, Michael, because he wrote it in his paper in whenever it was 2004, his paper, showing remorse. It's called Showing Remorse by Richard Wiseman. But Richard talks about the importance of suffering. Like there actually has to be an enactment of suffering. Otherwise,
yes, there does have to be an emotional component of remorse. So if you think of remorse as an internal experience, certainly there has to be strong emotion, I think. Whether that comes out in the courtroom or other setting, because people differ in the amount they actually express emotion, is a whole other matter. So if you didn't show any emotion and you did all those other things, I somehow doubt that would be regarded as remorse from another's perspective. An apology and remorse. So apology is more the speech act. And remorse is some sort of complex internal experience.
It's after 5 o'clock, and we know.
We might. I mean, it's such a fascinating topic. We could banter like this for hours. But look, I would really like to thank, or can we all please thank our guests? And Michael, thank you so much for joining us. And this is really we've taken the technology to another level. So I would also like to thank our wonderful tech team and Mike Baber, who's made this all happen. So could we please thank Michael, Sarah and Kate. And I recommend that we all run out and buy the book and read these chapters for ourselves. So thanks for joining us, everybody. The recording will be available so you can relive all these moments over and over and over again.